Hey guys, how you all doing and ting, you understand? Me back and we're gonna see. This is a third part. I had to break up the second one into two parts because it's so long. The third part of why did Britain abolish slavery and thing, you know what I mean? And we left off where finally there's communication that more than likely is given an eyewitness account of how the slaves were treated. You had the Jamaican uprising, and then the religious folk missionaries getting blamed for the uprising, and they too getting prosecuted for it, and then they're going back to England and telling of the stories of brutality on the slaves and brutality on themselves. So let's continue watching this to see how everything plays out. Let's YouTube and simmer, shall we?
In 1828, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was 58 years old. He was greyer, thinner, and increasingly deaf, but he had retained the patrician bearing and self-confidence with which he once bestrode the battlefields of Europe. Since Lord Grenville's Ministry of All Talents had abolished the slave trade in 1807, the Tory party had not failed once to win an election up until this point. There had been quite a selection of Tory prime ministers in that time, however, due to internal fractures in the party and the ill health of those such as George Canning, who died as Prime Minister in 1827, and the ill fortune of Spencer Perceval, who became the first and only Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to be assassinated.
You know, I hear a lot about the Tory party, and it seems like they have survived till now. I'm gonna have to I'm gonna have to watch a video about the Tory party, how they come about, you know, what are their traditions and all of that stuff there, what they have traditionally done and everything like that. I'm gonna have to look up a video of that, you know what I mean? Comment down in the comment section to all my British friends who will watch this with me. Tell me a little bit about the Tory party. I want to hear from you guys. You understand what I'm saying? And then, you know, and then I'm gonna watch. And if you have a video that you would like to see me react to concerning the Tory party, comment down below. That would be quite interesting. History, ain't it beautiful? Let's keep going here.
After Canning's death and the failure of Viscount Goderich to bring together Canning's fragile coalition of moderate Tories and Whigs, King George IV turned to the only man he thought could steady the ship. That, of course, being the Duke of Wellington. Arthur Wellesley had experience in government, but he was in no way a conventional politician. What he was, though, much to the delight of the West India interest, was a man extremely hostile to any slight mention of reform, whether that be parliamentary, religious, or colonial. He was, alongside his most trusted lieutenant Robert Peel, adamantly opposed to the prospect of emancipation in the West Indian colonies, and would become one of the Anti-Slavery Society's fiercest critics.
There's always one who leads many, but
From
there's
his
always one.
speeches in the House to his private papers, we have ample evidence of Wellesley's intentions to protect the interests of the planter class and curtail any propositions of amelioration or emancipation. It would be more wonderful to behold, he declared, the progress already made than to express any strong censure for what remained to be done. The Prime Minister made it very clear that he was satisfied with the progress of amelioration in the colonies thus far, and that he would disregard any propositions or instructions for the colonial governments. We have no more the power of governing these colonies by force, he said, than we have of governing this country by force. This was a bitter blow for the abolitionists, who yet again felt any momentum for their cause slowly slipping away. The Duke had made it very clear from the start that he had no intention of taking further steps to ameliorate the conditions of the enslaved populations in the West Indies, other than falsely exemplifying those measures already put in place. The Anti-Slavery Society could be sure of one thing. No emancipation bill would ever be passed with a Tory government in power, especially in such an unreformed parliament as that which existed in the 1820s, where pro-slavery lobbyists could effectively purchase seats in the House. All seemed
Wow.
lost, yet little did the abolitionists realise, after years of bad luck and concrete opposition, that good fortune was on its way. After 23 years in government, the fractures within the Tory party were quickly becoming detrimental to Wellington's administration. They had lost significant ground to the Whigs in the 1830 general election, called in direct response to the death of King George IV. Within the context of public unrest and rioting, the Duke's combined advocacy of Catholic emancipation and his deep-rooted hostility toward parliamentary reform caused a significant split within his party, and as a result, on the 15th of November 1830, he lost a vote of no confidence and submitted his resignation.
Wow.
This left England's new monarch, King William IV, little choice but to ask Lord Grey, leader of the opposition, the Whig Party, to form a new government. Earl Grey, previously known as Lord Howick, was the polar opposite of the Duke. He was an advocate of reform, both in Britain and in the West Indies. He was a leading voice in Parliament during the fight for the abolition of the slave trade, and he, perhaps more than anyone, understood the need to be pragmatic in his approach toward emancipation.
One of the key changes that takes place that allows for an abolition bill in 1833, amongst several, is a change of government. And just as in 1807, where there are Whigs in power, albeit briefly at that point, again, after a long period of Tory government, which has tended to be more sympathetic to planters and particularly to the more gradualist abolitionist arguments, by the 1830s, there's a new Whig government, much more open to the idea of emancipation and prepared to introduce the ending of slavery as part of a raft of reforming measures.
First on the agenda for Grey was reform. By 1830, this issue was at the heart of the British public psyche and maintained the basis upon which the electorate would vote in upcoming elections. It was one of the main reasons Wellington was forced to resign, and it would be the reason the Whigs would soon control and later dominate the House of Commons. After the Duke lost a vote of no confidence and Earl Grey was officially asked to form a government by the King, plans were immediately made to draft a reform bill to present in Parliament. There was no doubt that reform was needed and long overdue, not to mention its importance in paving the way for emancipation. To truly understand the significance of reform in the story of abolition, it's important we consider how the archaic system allowed the West India interest to maintain such a presence and stronghold in Parliament, despite not having the popular support and financial prowess it once boasted. The electoral franchise had not been extended since the 15th century. Now, this meant that the distribution of parliamentary seats was hideously imbalanced, and that the moneyed and landed classes were able to secure dozens of rotten and pocket boroughs. These were easy pickings for the West India interest. In simple terms, a rotten borough was a constituency in the United Kingdom which had an extremely small electorate and hence could be used by a patron to gain unrepresentative influence within the unreformed House of Commons. Many such rotten boroughs were controlled by landowners and peers who might give the seats in Parliament to their like-minded friends or relations. They were also commonly sold for money or other favours. This patronage was based on property rights, which could be inherited and passed on to heirs, or else sold.
And that happened on a small scale here. My brother-in-law told me a story one time where a sheriff, okay, he lives in Kentucky, and a sheriff paid him $200 to come over the border, which I mean is Kentucky, and they're right there on the border, and go over on the border and vote over there. $200. He went over there and vote. Was able to buy him some moonshine and thing with that money. So that happens all over the place and all eras and stuff like that. You know, the people buy vote all the time, buying seats all the time.
To put this into perspective, let's take the constituency of Gatton in Surrey. Now, this had a total of 7 voters, and yet was represented by 2 parliamentary MPs. Now, if we compare that with the industrial centres of Manchester, Leeds and Birmingham, with a combined total population of 750,000, these places were represented by a grand total of 0 MPs.
Now, that's a good way to keep the people shut up. They have no representation. Then they have no power. This is what leads to like riots and stuff like that. People feel they don't have any power. They don't want to take power. And that's why, you know, things get out of hand. Damn, 0? That's crazy.
In an attempt to eradicate this corruption, the first reform bill was presented to the Commons by Lord John Russell in March 1831 and made it through to a second reading. Despite the vote attracting a record 608 members, it was only approved by a margin of 1 vote. It seemed pushback was inevitable. It was unfortunately at the committee stage that the bill truly hit a brick wall. Isaac Gascoigne, the Liverpool MP, who had by no coincidence spent 35 years defending slavery, put forward a motion opposing the bill. This was carried against the government's wishes by 8 votes. It was at this point that Earl Grey dissolved Parliament and called for a general election. He knew that the electorate was generally in favour of reform, and that achieving a larger majority in the House may be the only way of passing the reform bill. It was never really even a gamble. In May and June, voters went to the polls in an effective referendum on reform. A landslide victory for the Whigs resulted, who now commanded a majority of over 130 seats. This result was monumental. With a large majority, the Whigs were now able to pass a reform bill. They now had the numbers where it mattered. There would, of course, be stumbles along the way. The second bill did not pass through the House of Lords, but resulting violent public riots gave even those vehemently opposed to reform no choice in the matter. The third bill was introduced in December 1831, around the same time as the violent uprising in Jamaica, and was eventually given royal assent on the 7th of June 1832.
It's funny how they put up such a fight until people get so angry they start burning down stuff and carrying on. It seems throughout history, and I know it happened a lot in my country, you know, it's just like, no, we're not going to do it. No, we're not going to do it. And then when the population say, oh, you're going to do it, or we're going to do this, you're going to cripple the economy, we're going to do this, then they go, okay. Why does it always have to come to that?
This was a pivotal moment for those who had fought for emancipation for so long.
So some West Indian MPs are members of Parliament for Rotten boroughs, essentially bought seats in Parliament. And one of the effects of the 1832 Reform Bill is to change this system. And it means that after 1832, there are far fewer, or at least significantly fewer, West Indian MPs in Parliament. And of course, what I mean by a West Indian MP is a member of that West India interest, a planter or a merchant deriving a large share of their income from properties in the Caribbean. And so that group is much less of a parliamentary powerhouse than it had previously been by the time that Parliament is debating, finally, full emancipation in the 1830s.
The abolitionists were now in a position of unrivaled strength. They had removed the final obstacle in the way of emancipation, the vicious presence of the West India lobby in Parliament. The third and final pillar had fallen. 1833, emancipation was inevitable. Lord Grey's decision to call yet another election in 1832, which led to an extended Whig majority in Parliament, had all but ensured this. The question was who would take responsibility for proposing this bill. The Prime Minister's eldest son, Henry Grey, had been working tirelessly alongside Viscount Goderich for some time on drafting an emancipation bill. But Charles Grey had different ideas. Both Henry and Goderich were far too radical for his liking, and so he turned to his trusted colonial secretary, the Earl of Derby, Edward Stanley. A rising star in the political sphere, Stanley was a more attractive candidate in terms of retaining the support of the moderate Whigs and liberal Tories, not only for the bill, but also for the Whig government in general. He was admittedly one of the most conservative of Grey's ministers, and his approach to drafting a slave emancipation bill would certainly reflect this fact. On a Tuesday evening, on the 14th of May 1833, Edward Stanley rose in the House. The chamber was full. His ministerial proposition for the emancipation of slaves had been preceded by a great deal of boisterous and unruly behaviour. But once the chamber quietened down, Stanley proceeded.
Sir, I feel most anxious on account of the responsibility which devolves upon me. I feel not only that our maritime commerce is here concerned, but that the interests, the comforts, the prosperity, perhaps I might say the very existence of a large population in the West India colonies, depending upon us for support and protection, hang upon the decision of those resolutions which it will be my duty to submit to the House. Nor can I conceal from myself the immense influence on the population of foreign countries which must arise from the result of the mighty experiment which we now propose to make. Besides all these things, there is enough to make any man, the strongest, the boldest, and the best, shrink in some degree under the weight of so great a responsibility.
So Stanley, the colonial secretary, introduces the Emancipation Bill finally into Parliament in 1833, and one of the things he says about it is that it's a mighty experiment in his words, because of course the colonies had always run as plantation colonies using slave labour. So what's being proposed here is a significant change, and that's one of the reasons I think that he describes this as a mighty experiment. What he knows that he's introducing is a significant social transformation in the Caribbean colonies.
And so, on that late spring evening, it was officially announced that as of the 1st of August 1834, slavery would be abolished in the British dominions. The title of property in man would no longer be recognised in British law. There were, however, two major caveats. The first was that the enslaved population would be free in name only, under a system of apprenticeship in the colonies for 12 years. The second was that slaveholders, and not the enslaved, would be compensated for the loss of their property.
There are two other elements to the Emancipation Bill of 1833. One is an apprenticeship scheme, a so-called apprenticeship scheme, which effectively kept enslaved people as working as they had as slaves for a full 4 years after the Emancipation Bill comes into effect. The other is compensation, which really recognises the slaveholders' arguments about slavery and property. Slaveholders had argued throughout this process that to end slavery would essentially, in their view, be to rob them of what they called their property, enslaved people. And the compensation part of the bill recognises the validity of that claim and essentially pays them off for the freedom of enslaved people. And so it's a really important part of the bill, and it helps in the sense that a number of MPs who are slaveholders are willing to vote for this bill. But I think more importantly
they're
is
getting paid.
the part of the bill that allows for colonial legislatures to reluctantly, begrudgingly accept the reality that they need to ratify this legislation, and they do. You know, where there is a legislature, it passes through. The colonial legislature in Jamaica, in Barbados, compensation is the way that that's done. That's how the wheels of this piece of legislation are oiled, and it's how it becomes possible to get it through. Essentially, the planters are bought off.
After the £15 million loan was increased to a one-off grant of £20 million, equating to 40% of the British government's annual budget at the time, and equal to roughly £17 billion in today's money. Only the most pragmatic of abolitionists avoided a feeling of utter anathema at the prospect. Even if providing compensation was the only practical way of emancipating those in the Caribbean, it was in itself an acceptance that slaves were property that could be bought off. This went against all that they had campaigned against for decades. After voting for compensation in order to push emancipation through, Thomas Buxton exclaimed, "I did it only to save bloodshed. That was my motive."
The bill that gets agreed in 1833 is the process of really intensive negotiations, and ultimately it is a compromise between government, between abolitionists, and between the West India interest. And many abolitionists are disappointed with elements of it, including the compensation clause. And it's significant that the one group, of course, that is left out of these negotiations are enslaved people themselves. So the compensation effectively is the government, the British public, taxpayers, paying slaveholders for emancipation. And absolutely it goes against the central tenets of the abolitionist argument. Because what was the central tenet of the abolitionist argument, where it all starts in 1787? Is, am I not a man and a brother? And the Emancipation Bill of 1833, whilst it concedes many of those abolitionist arguments and accepts them as persuasive, still treats enslaved people in some way as though they were property.
Whatever those in the abolitionist camp thought of the grant, it was almost certainly upon this basis that King William IV, a firm opponent of emancipation, finally approved the bill. On the 28th of August 1833, an Act for the Abolition of Slavery in the British colonies was given royal assent.
So, in essence, what happened is that the ordinary working man ended up paying for the emancipation of the slaves. Somebody told me they just recently stopped paying on that. Wow. So rich people still won in the end. That's crazy. The rich plantation owners still won in the end because they just took poor people's money. Pretty much.
Of the 12 men who had founded the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, only one had survived to see the whole institution collapse, a certain Thomas Clarkson. His close ally and linchpin of the abolition movement, William Wilberforce, had sadly died just a month before the act was given royal assent, although upon his deathbed he was undoubtedly secure in the knowledge that emancipation was to occur in the near future. It had been a long and hard battle for abolitionists. As in the run-up to the ratification of the 1807 Abolition Act, abolitionists who sought to end the entire institution of slavery met fierce opposition on both sides of the Atlantic. To terminate the slave trade was one thing, but to end an institution in which so many people had invested so much in every sense of the word would be to utterly ruin what had once been the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. The challenge may have been greater, but the arguments and evidence abolitionists had at their disposal were equally powerful. The West Indian colonies were now a stain and a burden upon the metropole, both morally and financially, and Britain had set its sights elsewhere in the East Indies. Ties between the West Indian colonies and Britain were also becoming increasingly strained. This was not helped by events in Jamaica in 1831 and the brutal backlash that unearthed the true nature of the planter, who could no longer play the victim. Nonetheless, as was the case in 1807, abolitionists also required an element of good fortune and timing. The split in the Tory party allowed a Whig government to rise to power, one determined to see slaves emancipated, and one that controlled an overwhelming majority after the Great Reform Act was passed.
Finally, those who called for emancipation had to be pragmatic. If change was ever to occur, judging by the years of disappointment and opposition and delay, concessions had to be made in the form of compensation, no matter the burden upon the nation's conscience.
I suppose one question to think about is how might emancipation, as it was decided by Parliament in 1833, have looked from the perspective of enslaved people in the colonies? And we know something about that because, well, of course, there are all sorts of documents and sources about the kinds of celebrations, for example, that accompany the Emancipation Bill and full emancipation, which finally comes in 1838 after the end of the apprenticeship system. But there are all sorts of ongoing legacies of the institution that we also need to think about even after this very long-drawn process of emancipation is finished.
That was quite interesting there. I mean, I've heard of it, but I've never, went in depth into it. Drop me in the comment section. Tells me what you think about all of this here. If you enjoyed or learned something from what I've just reacted to, please drop a like on it, and go ahead and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you know when I'm putting out new videos. I do all kinds of topics here, cultural, historical. You understand what I'm saying? I'm not gonna box myself into anything specific, but it's all going to be something that we're going to learn something from. The more we know, the more we learn about each other, the better understanding we have of each other. All right, I'm going to leave a link in the description to this video, so you can go check it out. I'll also leave links to the first two parts of this, so you all can check it out and watch it with me. You all take care of each other. All right, cool runnings.